So good morning, I guess. I'm Bob Measel. I'm the ESL Bilingual Advisor from the Department of Ed and the Title III Director for the state. And I was asked to come here and talk to you about the new accountability system for ELs in Pennsylvania, and more generally what that means, you know, the kind of trend for ELs that's going on right now in terms of federal and state law and policy. So it's pretty deadly stuff, I know, but I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. So if you guys don't fall asleep, then I'll consider that a win, and we'll all make it out of this alive. Just really quick before I get started, how many of you here are ESL teachers? Is there an ESL teacher in here?
No.
There is none. How many of you are administrators? There are no administrators. Excellent. That is good. I can tell my administrator jokes and I won't get dirty looks. Okay, how many of you in here remember NCLB? The No Child Left Behind Act. Okay.
Sorry.
Really? It's not that early yet, still. NCLB, right, came out in 2000 whatever, and it lasted way, way longer than it was supposed to. Okay, NCLB was the federal law that had to do with funding schools in the United States, all right? Under Title I and Title III and some other things. It required that states do certain things for accountability. Accountability is one of those great ideas that once it hits Congress, it will never go away, so it's here forever. And it goes like this. We're giving these schools money. They can't do whatever they want. We've got to make sure that they work. Sounds like a good idea, right? And it is, except the way they do it is wrong all the time. So NCLB, what it did was it said, okay, you're going to hold schools accountable based on these tests in math and ELA. And 100% of students are going to be proficient or advanced by 2014, I think it was. Okay, does anybody see the problem with that? It's a joke, it's rhetorical. Yeah, it had a fatal flaw, which is that, like, that's nonsense. Not 100% of anything's going to happen by 2014, and it didn't. Remarkably silly in that whole system was the belief that all ELs were going to be proficient in English by 2014, which is just bizarre, because the only way that happens is if everybody on the planet starts speaking English all of a sudden. But they're not going to, and kids are going to continue to come here from other countries, so we are always going to have kids who are not proficient in English, which is not a problem for them or the school. But NCLB and the accountability system previously had a way of making that seem like a problem. It really wasn't. Now, whoa, I'm going the wrong way. ESSA, how many of you heard of the Every Student Succeeds Act? A couple people. All right. The Every Student Succeeds Act is the new NCLB. NCLB went away. ESSA is the new law. They should have passed that law years and years and years ago, but it's Congress, so they didn't. So now the new law is very different than NCLB. ESSA shifts, the pendulum has swung the other direction now. The focus all throughout ESSA is on states making their own decisions about things. It still requires that we have accountability, but it doesn't tell us how to do it, like NCLB did. And it doesn't tell us what we have to do if schools don't meet their targets. ESSA did a couple of things, though. You guys know Title I, right? You know what Title I is. Have you heard of Title III? Title III is the supplemental funding that a school can get if they have ELs in their school. It's not a lot of money. I don't even know if your school gets it. Before, what would happen is if your school took Title III money, then you were held accountable for your ELs making progress and then attaining English proficiency on time, and then also that proficient or advanced on the state academic tests all over again. ESSA took accountability out of Title III and it put it in Title I. And that's important because now it's school-based and it's any school that receives Title I money, which is an awful lot more schools. It didn't tell the states how to set up the accountability system, though, which was great. It means that we got to decide how to set up the system to measure accountability for ELs. Now, when I first started state work a long time ago, I used to think that things were simple, and I learned that lesson over and over and over. And things are not simple when it comes to learning. You can have one of two things. You can have a system that is simple and easy to understand, and I guarantee you that it's not going to work right. And it's also going to be unfair to schools and teachers and kids. Or you can have a system that is wildly complicated but works pretty well, and then you have to figure it out. So what we went with finally was the complicated system that actually works. Because learning a second language is not simple, and measuring it is not simple, and then setting up expectations for it are not simple. They shouldn't be. all kids don't grow the same way. I know that's a mind-bending concept, right? So ESSA required that we hold schools accountable using these criteria here. Proficiency in reading and math. Again, it didn't tell us how, though. It said you have to do that, but you figure it out. Graduation rates for high schools. The third one is English language proficiency, which is a big deal. EL's finally made it into like the center stage here. The fourth one is for elementary, middle school, some other growth measure. And then the last one, ESSA said you can figure out what else you want to use, what else is important to you. Pennsylvania decided that chronic absenteeism and college and career readiness were the two that we would hold schools accountable for under that fifth element there. Fifth element. I never said that before. That's funny. Okay, so for the EL indicator, we had to go find the research for it. These are the two organizations that we relied on heavily for this. How many of you in here have heard of WIDA? By a show of hands. 2, 3 people, a couple people. How many of you in here have not heard of WIDA before, which is perfectly fine? A couple hands. All right. WIDA used to stand for Wisconsin, Delaware, and Arkansas, because those are the 3 original states in the consortium. Then a whole bunch more states joined, and they changed it to something else, world-class instructional design and assessment or whatever. Now WIDA just means WIDA. It's just a name. They are the consortium of states. There are 38 states in it now. Pennsylvania is a member that produce the access test for us, which is that English test that ELs take every year right now. They're taking it now. So they produced the test, and they also produced our English language proficiency standards. WIDA. WIDA is part of the University of Wisconsin. That's where they're based out of. So the Wisconsin Center for Education Research is part of WIDA. They're the folks who we go to get all the research that we need to make decisions. And CCSSO is this big political organization composed of all the secretaries of ed and commissioners of ed from all the states across the country, and they get together and they organize groups and they do research and they advocate for things on behalf of schools, the Fed. So we used research from both these organizations to come up with the system that we've got. So,
Bob, can I interrupt? What?
Oh yeah, by the way, anybody can interrupt me at any point because I talk really fast.
EL?
EL, I'm sorry, English learner. Yeah, ELs. When we talk about.
How's that different from?
It's the same as ESL.
No. Okay, we'll go through a quick, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I'm going to use a lot of acronyms, and if I say something and you don't know what it is, just ask. So thank you. EL is English learner. That's how we refer to the kid. ESL is English as a second language. That usually refers to like the program.
Aren't we all English learners?
Yes.
Okay. I'm an English learner.
You bet. So am I. Everybody is. Let me make the distinction for you. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States provides specific protections for students who may not receive an adequate education because their home language is something other than English. In other words, their home language is tied to their national origin. You cannot discriminate based on national origin in this country because of the 14th Amendment and Title VI. So that's what makes them different than us being English learners. We are English learners. Everybody's always learning the language. And it's in English, oddly enough, it's always changing. But they are a protected class of people. So English learner is a particular class of student. So English learner is how we refer to the kid. ESL is usually the program. You might hear me say ELD, that means English language development. All these things are kind of like almost interchangeable. But when I say L or EL, that's what I mean. I'm talking about the kid. ESL teachers are still called ESL teachers because that's the name of the certificate that they get. They haven't changed the name of that yet, so it's still ESL.
Can I ask one other question?
Yeah.
So you are here to tell us about the state of Pennsylvania's response to the national ESSA?
Yes.
No Child Left Behind was national.
Yes.
It became ESSA.
That's correct.
So what you're doing is now telling us Pennsylvania's take on this.
How is it impacting Pennsylvania?
Okay.
How have we changed our regulations and accountability systems in response to the change in the federal law? Yes. It might not apply to your school. I'm pretty sure the high school doesn't even have the right number of ELs here to even be included in this system. They will eventually. But there's a larger theme here, which is the spreading of responsibility for English English language development and other things that I'm going to hit on a little bit. So the accountability system, I'm going to go through it quickly. It's very complicated. The point isn't that you understand all the nuance of it. It's just that you kind of have a general understanding of how is this working for schools, why is it important for us in our school, and what should I be doing in my classroom. I can skip to the end and give you the answer. It's like you should be doing the best you can to teach these kids content in English. And the $1,000,000 question is, well, how do we do that? And I'll get to that at the end. So there are a couple things that you have to understand about ELs, which drove the design of their system and should probably have an impact on how it is that you plan instruction for them as well. And that is, there's a maxim that we use here. It's lower is faster and higher is slower. What that means is students at lower proficiency levels tend to make larger gains from one year to the next than kids at higher proficiency levels. And kids at lower grades tend to make larger gains than kids at higher grades. I think most people kind of assume that intuitively. It seems like younger kids learn a language much quicker than older kids. How many of you believe that's true? It's not a trick question. It's actually not, oddly enough. It's not true. It appears to be true, but it's not. Kids at higher grades have a lot more language to learn, but they actually learn it, as far as anybody can tell, at least as fast as younger kids, if not faster. Because they have mechanisms for learning that I have learned over time, that metacognitive stuff, whereas little kids don't have that yet. They're still developing all those skills. But they appear to take longer, because if you're a kindergarten and you have no English, your English-speaking peers are here. That's proficiency at kindergarten. If you're a non-English speaking person in 10th grade, well, academic language proficiency is way out here. So you've got much more ground to cover there. But on the test from year to year, kids at lower grades do make larger gains on the test from one year to the next than kids at higher grades. This is what it looks like. This is a chart for like 6th to 8th graders. But if you see here, this is their initial starting proficiency level. So one year they took that English test and they scored low, 2.0, down around the bottom on the 1 to 6 scale. But if you look, the lines here represent the gains. The dots are gains that they made in scale score points from one year to the next. And you see the slope here. That means that kids at lower proficiency levels are making much larger gains from one year to the next than kids who start off way up here. It's just a phenomenon. There is a lot of debate about why that's the case, but it's just what we see generally. Now, if you were to compare this 6th to 8th grade chart to the kindergarten chart, you'd see that same slope, but it would be way more pronounced, because kindergartners make larger gains than kids at middle and high school. So that's important. You know what that means for us? That you can't set one growth target for all kids, because it doesn't make sense for all kids. Kids grow differently depending on where they're at, right? What grade they're in and what's their proficiency level. So we had to come up with, I'll talk about that in a minute. We had to come up with targets for every individual kid in the state. And not targets that were static either, but targets that changed. So we had to answer a couple questions right away. What's the maximum amount of time that we're going to give kids to attain? We can't give them forever. We expect kids to become proficient after a certain number of years. Anybody got any idea how many years it is? Yeah.
7?
Close. It's not 7. 6. We said 6. The research says it's anywhere from 5 to 7 years. We said 6. Most states went with 5. We pushed a little bit. The Fed did complain about it, but we said, look, we had the research to show that 6 was a good number, so they had to accept it. Not for all kids, though, right? I mean, if you're coming in and you're at like level 4.5, do we want to give you 6 years? No. We only give the full 6 years to kids at the lower proficiency levels. And as you get higher in proficiency, you get less time. The next thing is we had to define what's proficient mean. And that's simply, remember the access test is that annual English test that our English learners take. It's a 5.0 on that test. So if it comes back and it says your proficiency is 5.0, you have attained English. That's how we count you. I'm not going to go into this very much here. I'll mention it quick. So on the access test, like most tests, there are a couple of different scores, right? You get a scale score, which is this magical 3-digit number. It has all kinds of magical properties I don't understand because I'm not a psychometrician. And then you get a proficiency level based on that. So for PSSA, it's pretty simple. You get whatever that number is. I don't know what the numbers are for PSSA. 290. What's that mean? We don't know. It means proficient, right? That's what you're interested in. Is it basic, proficient, or advanced? It's the same thing for access. You get whatever number this is. It's kind of meaningless on its own. What proficiency level does that translate into, though? Here's the kicker, though. You'll notice that grade 1, to get a 5.0, you need a scale score of 344. But if you're in 12th grade, you need 434 to get a 5.0. You have to score much higher in higher grades. And that's because the language demands are higher at higher grades. So it's important for us to know if we say, well, we're going to give you 6 years to attain proficiency, we've got to look down the road 6 years and say, what grade are you going to be in 6 years? So that we can figure out what target are you trying to hit in 6 years from now. Because if we set it at whatever grade you're in now, it's going to be set too low. All right. I already talked about that. This is how we do it. Each individual kid, we go to this table and we say, all right, this is year 0. You just showed up here from another country or wherever. You take your access test that year. It's your first test. So you're not included in the calculation yet. We want to know what's your baseline score. Let's say you're starting off at 1.0 or 1.2 or 1.3. Then we're going to give you 6 full years. And we say out here in year 6, we expect you to attain. It's not just enough for us to wait around for 6 years, though, to see if you attain on time. You need interim targets for growth. And each year we calculate your interim target growth based on the formula that's in there. And it's simply based on how far do you have to get and how long do you have to get there at any given point. So we'll walk through an example here. So let's take a first grade student who scored a 1.2. They got a scale score of 180 in that first year, which is a 1.2. That means that we're going to give them the full 6 years. Remember from the table here, let me go back. If you came in at like 4.2, you'll notice that you don't get 6 years. You get 2 additional years. We expect you to attain 2 years later. That's because you don't need as much time. You're already much higher on the proficiency continuum. So, based on what we have in that first year, we say, okay, you're a 1.2, you got a scale score of 180, we're going to give you 6 years. So we go out here to our table, and we say, that table I just showed you, we say, what is the cutoff for a 5.0 in 6th grade? What's that attainment target? Turns out that it's 399. So now we know where you're at, when we expect you to get there, what we expect you to get. Then the next question is, what's the target you're trying to hit in year 2? So, since we have the baseline of 180, which was the previous year, and we know what they're trying to hit eventually, and we know how many years they've got to get there, we just plug in the numbers to the formula that's in there, and it turns out that this kid's target, this kid's individual target for year 2 was a gain of 44 scale score points, or we expect them to hit at least 224 the next year. That's the number. That's their target. This kid made a gain of 52 scale score points, so they exceeded their target by 8 points. What do you think will happen to their target the following year? It's going to go what? Up? It's going to go down. Their target will decrease. And the reason is because this year they exceeded it by 8 points. So what's going to happen the following year is it's only 42 scale score points is what we expect them to make the next year. The reason is they don't have to be on the same trajectory. They made a much larger gain. This is what it looks like on a chart. See, the blue line is the target. It's not static. It's not saying we expect you to make 50 points every year. It depends on the kind of growth that you're making. This kid in this example here, the yellow line is what their actual achievement is, and the blue line is the target. You'll see the kids making exceeding their target greatly in the first couple of years. So the target kind of flattens off a little bit. It doesn't keep going straight up. But the kids' gains also taper off. So the targets respond to how the kids are growing. If the kids are growing really fast, the targets will get smaller and smaller. And what that's telling you is you don't have to make very large gains to attain on time. You're still on the right trajectory. If a kid's growing very slowly, the targets will keep going up, saying you need to make up a lot of growth to get there on time. That's how they work. Everybody good with that? All right. So now that we know how we calculate kids' individual targets, you've got a bunch of EL kids in your school, right? They've all got their own targets, and in any given year, they will either make their target or they won't. They either attain on time if that's the year they're supposed to attain, or they made their growth target, or they didn't. What we do with that data is just simply calculate the percent. What percent of the kids made their individual targets in your school? That's it. There are a couple of rules about how we include the kids. They have to be there for the whole year. A kid can't show up in December. Well, if they show up in December, they take the test. That's their baseline year. But if they show up from another district, we don't go back to their previous access scores. We just start them over. So that's their baseline year all over again. If kids move from one school to another within your district, though, we do count that. I'll go over the rules in a little bit more detail later. So that's it. So your school gets a percentage calculated for it, and they put that out in the Future Ready Index, which I'll show you in a minute. So then the question becomes, what kind of targets are schools supposed to be hitting? Let's say that you've got 50% of your kids are making their targets. Is that good? Is it bad? Is it enough? ESSA said every state has to set long-term goals for itself for all ELs in the state, and then figure out what's your baseline and then what are your interim target gains so that you can get to your long-term goal. We decided 2030 was going to be our year. That's our long-term goal. And we had to figure out, what's the state baseline and what's going to be our 2030 long-term goal. And then we figure out the targets for schools. This is how we did it. The state's actual current performance last year was 40.7. So 40.7% of ELs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania made their individual targets. We said our 2030 goal is going to be, what's the difference between where we're at now and 100%? Turns out that the difference is 59.3%. We're going to take half of that. So by 2030, we want to get halfway to 100% from where we're at to reduce that gap by 50%. So that means that the state's 2030 goal is 70.3. Those are important numbers to remember because this drives what goes on in schools. And that's what it looks like. So you divide that difference out by 13 years and you'll see 40.7. The next year it's going to be, or it was 43 last year. This year our goal was 45.3 and so on. It goes up. That's how we're going to get to our 2030 goal. That's all ELs in the state, and that's what we have to report to the Fed every year. Now, the question that you want to know is like, what about my school? Okay, this is where it gets almost mind-bogglingly complicated for a couple of these scenarios. There's the all English learner group. That's all ELs in your school. Then there are subgroups within that EL group, like economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, all those things. I'll show you what they are in a minute. Let's first talk about the all EL group, right? There's two numbers that you got to keep in mind. Remember the state baseline, 40.7, and the state long-term goal of 70.3. Scenario one is, if your baseline, when the folks at the data office explained this to me, I made them draw me a picture, so I did that for everyone else's benefit too. So here's the state baseline, state long-term goal. We got to get there by 2030, and we have these target increases each year along the way until we get to the 2030 goal. If your school's baseline is higher than the state's baseline, you've got to get to the state long-term goal, which is 70.3, but your target increases are smaller, obviously, because the gap is smaller. If your baseline is below the state baseline, well, you've still got to reach the state long-term goal, but your target increases are going to be much greater because you've got a much bigger gap. And there are some schools out there that are starting off at like 17%. They've got to get to 70% by 2030. Those are big increases. Now, let's say that your baseline, and this happened in a few cases, is already past the 2030 goal. You start like 74% of your kids made their target last year. We just expect you to stay where you're at, not to go back. But we don't expect you to make any more gains. You're already good. Now's the weird stuff. So if in EL subgroup, let's say, for example, English learners with disabilities, the state will calculate a baseline and a long-term goal, just like we did for the all EL group. For all of those, we have calculated it for all of those subgroups. So, scenario number one is your school's baseline for that subgroup started off below the state. Well, you still got to get to the state's long-term goal for that subgroup by 2030, but you have larger target increases. It's pretty straightforward. If you start off beyond the state 2030 goal, same thing, we just expect you to stay there. Okay, so if the state's 2030 goal for ELs with disabilities is 62%, and you start off at 70, you stay at 70. Here's the weird one. And I don't know, I still don't really fully understand why this is like this, but I'll just tell you. If your EL subgroup, like ELs with disabilities, if your baseline is above the state baseline for that subgroup, but below the state baseline for the all EL group, then you get a custom 2030 target for your school for that subgroup based on that method of like halfway to 100% by 2030. You guys will not have to ever worry about that. You don't even have, and at the high school, I don't know about some of your other schools, at the high school you don't even have enough kids to count yet. So that's kind of a long shot, but just so you know, it's a piece of trivia. So here's how the overall accountability plan works. Step one is the state identifies schools that have both low growth and low achievement on the academic content tests, ELA and math, right? Out of those schools, they go and they look and they sort out the bottom 5% for the EL indicator and graduation rate. And then the step three is they find additional high schools that have low graduation rate because that's required under the federal law. I'll show you how it works. So this is that chart. It shows growth and achievement. That's achievement. This is growth. You're looking for each one of these represents a school. Schools out here that have both low growth and low achievement. Here's an interesting question. If these dots represented kids, where do you think ELs fall on a plot like this if you give them like a test in math, the math test? Anybody? Low growth, low achievement, high achievement, low growth. What do you think? No one has an opinion about that? Huh? High achievement?
Low growth.
Low growth?
High growth, low achievement.
High growth, low achievement. That's the opposite. Yeah, you're right. And I'll tell you why. ELs, let me put it to you like this. Everybody in here knows basic math, right? You have to be a math person, but you can all like add and subtract and multiply. If I were to give you a test of basic math in Russian, you'd probably all fail it. If I wrote out the instructions and whatever. It's not because you don't know basic math, it's because you don't know Russian. Now let's say for 1 year, we give you Russian lessons. And we give you that same test next year. Do you think that you will do better on it the following year?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Is it because you learn more math? No, it's because you learn more Russian. Weird, huh? So if you give kids a test in mathematics that is in English and they don't speak English, I know this is weird, they won't do well on it. But if you give them that same test again the next year, they will show a lot of growth. Is it because they learn more math? We don't know. But they learn more English, so they'll appear to grow on the math test. Mind-boggling, right? It's a phenomenon. It's because of the way we test kids. We give them a test in English. So ELs will show very large growth because presumably they are learning math, but they're also learning English, so they can access more of the test construct the following year. But they show low achievement because they still don't speak English. Okay. Step two. So we figured out we've got a list of schools that should have both low growth and low achievement in ELA and math. We go to step two for those schools, and we use what we call the Christmas chart here. And I'll tell you why we call it that. There's a funny story about this. So the states all had to come up with their ESSA plan, and if you ever seen one of these things, they're massive and they're complicated, and like hundreds of people work on it, and then you have to compile it, and it's like, hundreds of pages long. And so we finally get it all done, and we have to submit it by September to the Fed. And the Fed's going to review our plan and get back to us and say, yeah, it looks good to us. Go ahead and submit it for final approval. Or they're going to get back to us and say, okay, here are the 18 things in there that we think are not going to fly. Go fix it and then resubmit it to us for approval. And in Pennsylvania, it has to go through the governor's office, so he's got to sign it. They told us at PDE, they're like, we're going to get this call from the Fed. And when they do call us, we don't care if you're on your way to the moon, you've got to come back to this office and be here for that phone call. Everybody who worked on this plan has to be in the room when we're on the phone with the Fed, because we're not going to have much time to make the changes. They called 3 days before Christmas, and we're all in the room, and they had this laundry list of stuff they wanted us to go and fix in the plan, and we had like 2 days to do it, because it had to get to the governor's office before they shut down the state so they could sign it and we could get it submitted to them on time. Everybody had to work like over Christmas, essentially, on it. And they were very irritated by that. So they made the chart red and green when they sent it to the Fed to be like a subtle reminder, like, we worked over Christmas on this. It's a true story. So, okay. So now you're a school that has both low growth and low achievement. They come here, there are two different kinds of indicators. The substantially weighted ones, which are the EL indicator, and graduation rate. Then there are the other ones. Remember I talked about them in the beginning. That's that fifth element there that the state decided on, which is chronic absenteeism and career readiness. Well, the substantially weighted indicators, if you're in the bottom 5% of either one of those, you're automatically identified for CSI, which is comprehensive support and improvement. That's the classification for your school if you're like, on the naughty list. So if you miss your EL indicator, but your graduation rate is fine, you're in. If your EL indicator is fine and you miss your graduation rate, you're in. If you miss both of them, you're in. If you're not a high school, this just doesn't count. For these, though, you have to miss them both. So if you miss just one of these, but the other one's okay, you're not in. If you're in the bottom 5% of both, however, you're in. Yeah?
What's an indicator for career readiness?
You know, I really don't know. I'm not sure how they measure that. I'm not kidding. There are things that the state has put out there that they expect schools to do, like career counseling for, and I've heard this come up in meetings with the secretary, you know, and people are like, how do you do like career counseling for a first grader? And like, well, there are things that you can do
to take guidance lessons at our grade level that are called career readiness, but
right.
That's an indicator, like that,
yes.
That one-day guidance lesson?
I can't speak to like what's enough, because I haven't looked at that part of the plan closely enough to figure it out. But yes, that is part of career readiness, and that's why you're doing it, because it is a measure of school quality. So yeah, the expectation is, and based on pretty good research, you know, that it's important for kids to be thinking about what it is that they want to do, the direction they want to be going, even if it changes all the time. But it's important for them to think about that throughout their academic experience in K-12. So the state has set that up as an expectation, measures that for schools. And it's not some kind of like outcome on a test. It's what activities are you doing that meet the criteria for this, and then you report that to the state, and the state determines, is it meeting, you know, yeah.
Just one more question. The economically disadvantaged ESL student, the baseline is lower, but the expectation by 2030 is the same. So they're expected to make larger growth than a regular EL student to meet that same goal.
Their long-term goal is going to be different too. Remember, the long-term, that 70.3 is only for the all EL group. So the economic, I don't know what the number is, but the economically disadvantaged subgroup will have its own 2030 goal. It might be 50%. I don't know. It's halfway to 100 from wherever the state baseline was. So are they expected to make larger gains? No, probably not. I can't imagine how that would be the case. Okay, so we're done with the Christmas chart. Everybody's good with this? That's step 2. And then the third step is just finding high schools that don't graduate enough students based on I think 4 and 5 year cohorts. So these are the rules. So minimum N is 20. That means you have to have 20 English learner students in your school 1 year, and those same 20 kids the next year for us to even make this calculation for you. You guys will get there. Your numbers are going up if you're not already. Students are counted by enrollment, not by the test. So if they're enrolled in your school but they don't take the test, guess what? They still count. They just count as not making their target. So you have to test the kids. I mean, otherwise everybody would just stop testing their kids. The students have to be full academic year. In other words, they got to be there from October through the testing window. October is the month that we take the data snapshot at the state. So we assume if they're there in October, then they were there at the beginning of the year, and they've got to be there for the full year. If they're not there for the full year, they don't count for your school. We don't include them in the calculation, to be fair. When students move into your district, even if it's from another district, they start over. That's their baseline year. But remember I said, if they move from one school to another school in your district, they don't start over. The scores keep going with them. If a student leaves, I don't know why, these questions always come up. It's usually administrators who do it to me. It's like the I gotcha question. Like, you didn't think of that, did you? Ha. Like, if a kid comes here and they're here and they end up in your data submission to the state in October, but then a half an hour later after you do that, you push send, they leave and they go to the Dominican for 4 months, but then they come back and they're there for the test, how do they get counted? Well, schools have the ability to go in and put that date first enrolled in there, and if that date first enrolled, even if they did show up in your October snapshot, if that date starts over, then they will not be counted. It'll be their baseline year. So the state is doing everything it can to be as fair as possible. We're not including students who you should not be held accountable for in every case that is possible for us to do. The scores go to the school where the kid took the test. This is another one of those gotcha questions I have to answer all the time. What if a kid is enrolled in XYZ elementary school and then they leave and they go to the other elementary school up the street right before they take the test? Who scores, which school gets that kid's scores? The school where the kid took the test. because we just had to pick one or the other, and that's the one we picked, and that's it. That is not going to happen enough to tip the scale somewhere. We never use screener scores. When kids first enroll, we give them a screener to figure out what their language proficiency is, and that's how we identify them as being an EL or not. Those scores never get used in accountability ever. Only the access score, that test they're taking now, the big annual one. And then the last question is, well, what if a kid doesn't attain on time? What if we gave until 6th grade and they didn't attain a proficiency in 6th grade? Well, they don't count as meeting their target that year. Let's say it's 7th grade and they still don't hit that 5.0. Well, they don't count. They count as 0, as not making their target. In 8th grade, if the kid finally attains in 8th grade, they do count. They count as meeting their target that year, and then they're out. Okay? All right, how many of you were involved in reclassification of English learners last year when they exited the program? One person. At least one person was.
Now wait, what do you mean when they exited the program?
In Pennsylvania, students are considered English learners while they're learning English until they get to the point where we say you're proficient and now you're exited from the program. You're no longer an EL. So we call that.
She wasn't exited last year.
Okay, but you're aware of what that process is, right?
I think so.
Okay, good. Well, that's encouraging. Like the first group I had this morning, like there were like 80 people in here and nobody had ever even heard of it. And I had a moment of panic because it blew up my whole presentation. Okay, so reclassification is the process whereby we make a determination that a kid is no longer an English learner and that they can be reclassified as a former English learner, and then they don't get any more ESL services or anything like that. Okay? This is weird. Okay, so like Pennsylvania, it used to be based on the access score. Once you hit a certain level, I think it was 5.0, then you were out. That was it. I'm just going to say this, all right? You guys might think this is funny or might think it's funny coming from me. But you should never, ever, ever, and you guys know this because you're teachers, you should never, ever make high stakes, important decisions about kids based on a single test score, right? Okay, there it is, I said it. It's not like we don't know, we know this stuff, okay? You know, we have to get these tests a lot of times because the federal law says we have to do it. Okay, so that's the same case for ELs. We don't want to say, well, just based on one single access score, you're either an EL or you're not, because those scores can, you know, I mean, maybe the kid had a bad day, who knows? Maybe they got lucky on the test. It's hard to say. So the obvious answer is, well, you know, and us trying to untangle this conundrum here is, well, who would know most about the kid and whether they're ready to be exited from this system or not? Who do you think that is? Right, they're teachers, right? Yeah. Okay, so in Pennsylvania we did something radical, and I do mean this, I'm not being sarcastic, it was radical, where we said teachers are going to have a say-so in this decision of whether or not kids should be exited. No other state in the country has done this. And now that we pulled it off one year, last year for the first time, I've got like 20 other states asking me questions about it now because they want to do it too. So I think it's a pretty awesome idea, and that's mostly because it was my idea. I'm kidding. So what we did was, but it has to be standardized and uniform. We can't say, because the Fed won't say, oh, no, that's the Wild West. You can't just say, well, teachers will decide, you know, they're going to write down on a sticky note like yes and no and yes and I don't know why in here. And it's got to be standardized to some degree. So what we did was we grabbed some rubrics that were developed by some researchers out in California. And it's rubrics for interaction, listening, speaking, and reading, and then writing. And we said, every year for any kid who's getting close to that cutoff point on the access test, we want their ESL teacher and at least one content teacher to each fill out these rubrics for them. And it's low, medium, or high. They're pretty straightforward. Low, medium, or high in these different areas: interaction, listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And then we just add up points from the rubrics. We had the ESL teacher's rubric to the content teacher's rubric. It was important for us to have content teachers doing this, because you have a different opinion about the kid's readiness to succeed in a classroom without ESL support. ESL teachers look at a kid, and a lot of times there's bias. There just is. It's natural. They will look at a kid and have a different opinion about their readiness to be in a content classroom, whereas a math teacher or an ELA or a science teacher might have a different perspective. So it was important to have both teachers weighing in. So you got to add those all together. And then instead of a single access cutoff score, it's a band of scores. It starts at 4.5 now on the 1 to 6 scale. So that's a little bit low. It used to be 5 or 5.5. Now we started at 4.5. Because we're saying teachers have input now. So maybe the kid's got a slightly low access score, but the teachers might know something about this kid that the access test is not telling us, which they can use to mitigate that and still exit the kid. So you add all so the higher your access score, the more points you get. You add all the points from the rubrics and the access score together. If you reach a threshold, then you can be reclassified. That's it. That's how it works. We couldn't include all that in the accountability system because that's just frankly crazy. Teacher input, like you guys manage that at the local level, like filling out these rubrics and adding up the points and all that stuff. We don't collect that data at the state. That would be chaos. We wouldn't be able to pull it off. So I always get the question, well, if you're including kids when they hit 5.0 as attaining proficiency, how's that jive with the reclass procedure? And the truth is they are not aligned. They just can't be. Kids will get reclassified. In other words, they will be not ELs anymore, probably way before they hit the 5.0 on access and get included as attaining proficiency for the accountability system. But it doesn't matter because each year we're not measuring how many kids attain. We're measuring how many kids hit their target that year. So as long as they're making growth on time, they'll always hit their targets, and then they get reclassified and they're no longer an L, and they just stop getting included in the calculation, and that's it. So it doesn't penalize schools or anything like that at all. So that's how that works. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the Future Ready Index quickly. What have we got, like 10 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. The Future Ready Index, and you can go check this out. Anybody can. It's public information. The state hasn't figured out the ESSA report card for schools yet. So what I'm going to show you is not technically accountability stuff, but it tells you for accountability purposes how your school's doing in all those different areas I just talked about, including EL. If you go to the PA webpage, which already looks different than this as of last week, there's a link to the Future Ready Index somewhere. This is what it looks like when you open it up. The first thing it's going to ask you is what school do you want to look up? You can look it up many different ways. In this example, we're using the location way because I think the map is cool. You click on a county, hover over the different areas in the county, it tells you what school district that is. Click on it, the dots represent schools, it'll tell you what school you're hovering over. You click on the school, and it brings you to the measures here, all the things I just talked about in the ESSA system. These are the state assessment measures, that's ELA and math, achievement and growth, remember. On-track measures, which is the EL indicator, which is what we've been talking about, and graduation rate. And then the college and career measures, which is that college and career readiness that we talked about a minute ago, the questions that you asked. This is the key. Blue means that you exceeded the state long-term goal already. You're starting off ahead of the long-term 2030 goal. Green means you met your target. Red means you didn't. Arrows will tell you whether or not you made an increase from the previous year or a decrease. For this example school, if you click down into it, state assessment measures, they missed their goal for ELA, for achievement, and they dropped from the previous year. They made their goal for growth, though, but also dropped for that year from the previous year. Yeah?
Can't you put Exeter in there?
This is static. I can't, but you can look it up. I'm not on the web on my machine. But you can go look this up, and you can go look at your school and see how you're doing.
I want to see it with you and hear what you have to say about it.
I am not going to say anything about it, even if it was up there, and that's why I do this with a static one and not just go online, because I'm not going to talk about that. These are just numbers. Remember, who knows what is it an indication that something might need to be done? Yeah, but we'll get into the nuance of that a little bit more in just a second. This particular school did meet their EL goal that year. Now, if you click on View All On-Track Measures here, it will tell you the percent that you actually made. You can do the same thing for the other ones. This school had 50% of their ELs meeting their individual targets that year. And it gives you the statewide average for that year and the statewide goal. You'll remember we were saying the statewide baseline is 3 or 7? The state went way down, went from 40% to 35 last year. Don't know why. It's not good. If you click on the student group breakdown, that will show you all those federally reportable subgroups within the EL group. And there they all are. Students with disabilities, English learner, economically disadvantaged, 2 or more races, so on. Okay, so here are 2 questions that always come up. What about kids who have disabilities? Do you have separate targets for them? The answer is no. And SLIFE. SLIFE is an unfortunate acronym. They invented it in New York and we adopted it here. It means students with limited or interrupted formal education. And because they included the word students in the acronym, if you go into the PIMS manual, which is the big state data system, there's a code for active ELs, it's 01. And then 05 is the code for active ELs with life. And that's how the data folks at PD talk about them. They're like, are these kids have life or not life? And we're like, but that's just what it is. So SLIFE is kids who have come from refugee camps or missed a lot of school. They have particular kinds of needs. We can't include them differently in the accountability system. We weren't allowed to for a long time. For students with disabilities, the Fed only just very recently made us aware that we can set different targets for them based on research, which has only just come around. It's not in our plan because they didn't notify us until after we had submitted our plan. If we revise the plan someday, we will likely go about doing that. And what that will mean is, for a kid who has a disability, we might say, you're at level 1. Instead of 6 years, we might give you 8 years or 9 years to attain, so you have smaller interim target gains, because that makes sense for kids with disabilities. But for now, that's just not the case. All right, we went through all that. We got like 5 minutes. Okay, does anybody have questions about anything I just explained? That's good. Here's the whole point. If you look at the state regs and you look at ESSA, there is a much greater focus on accountability for English learners now for schools. It's not at the district level, it's at the school level now. And it includes a lot more schools. If your school is not included in it yet, you probably will be soon because the numbers keep going up. Also within that is a lot of flexibility. And when we rewrote the regs last year, we intentionally took out all the prescriptive nonsense that was in there. And we said, we're putting the decision making back where it belongs at the school level. And we insist adamantly that when you're making decisions about your program design at your school, that you include your EL staff in that and other staff so that they can weigh in on how you're designing your program for ELs. It can be whatever you want. It just has to work, and you have to measure it, and you have to make sure it's working. This is one of the ways that you will measure how well your system's working. And if it's not, you are obligated under federal and state law to make changes to it. But it's no more of us telling you, you have a kid who's at level 1, they have to see an ESL teacher for 2 periods every day. Level 2 kids, you have to see them for 1 period every day. Level 3 kids, like on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We don't do that. We never really did, but we used to make recommendations in the regs. We don't do that anymore. We took all that out. What we say to schools is, you may do whatever you'd like. You can design your program however it suits you and your teachers and your kids best, but you've got to be responsible for those decisions now. Also in the regs, to go along with all that flexibility, is a kind of general insistence that you focus on language learning and content learning for ELs, and that you do that through collaboration within your staff. Dylan William has been studying this for years, and lots of people have written lots of great books about it, and articles and research papers. And you probably know this, like, you know, the death by in-service thing. Like, you can have experts coming in and sitting in workshops forever. It may have an impact on your teaching, but it might, you know, who knows. When teachers really, really grow, it's because they're working with each other in structured ways. So what we ask administrators to do is, please find time in your schedule, find time somehow to get your teachers working with each other. I get asked a lot about strategies in the classroom, and what I say is, like, look, I haven't been in a classroom in like 12 years. I'm not the right person to ask to give you advice about how to teach. But you do have a couple of experts. You're all experts, but if you want to know about strategies for English learners, you've got access to your ESL teacher. Go find them and ask them about strategies and run your lesson plans by them or whatever it is. Work together however you can. And then from the state level, we are pushing administrators to build that kind of stuff into teacher schedules more. So that's the big message, I guess, from the state. The takeaway is that you know, you guys are the experts at this stuff. Please tap into your expertise, use each other for support and help, learn from each other. You're going to get a lot more out of that than most other things. And share the responsibility for teaching ELs, both language and content. Anything else? Any questions? Unrelated to anything? Any other burning question you've had about anything at this state that you want to ask me? Nope. You just want to get out of here.
Well, I'm going to add something into that because I see we have a lot of Lawton Creek teachers seated here and some Lorraine teachers. And somebody asked me in the first session that I was actually pinch hitting for Bob this morning, you know, how the decision's made, and, you know, as Lawton teachers or Lorraine teachers, might we ever anticipate that ESL children come back to their home school? You know, as we look in a district where our numbers have increased double-fold in the district, and we're only up to 60-some students.
Yeah.
You know, when you compare that to a Reading that is 4,600 students that are L's, to an Exeter, however, for us here in Exeter, it is over double the amount of students we've had in the past. And so the other thing is with our population of Ls is it's a more transient population. Just before Christmas we had about 3 families move out and we had about 2 or 3 families move in. And so it's constantly a moving target, so to speak, and I literally am making that decision what's going to happen with placement and where I need to put ESL teachers through the summer, you know, as kids are coming in. So would we like them to be back in their home school? Absolutely, but that means that we have teachers that are traveling, and with that travel time, you know, we were losing up to an hour a day in travel time. So it's something that we're always looking at. The one thing I don't want to do, because it's very important, like for any child, is that we're not constantly moving them and saying, okay, you're all at Jacksonville this year, but now next year, because of your numbers, if you were an Awatin child, we're moving you back to Awatin. That's not fair to the child either. So we certainly are taking all of those things into consideration, but that's not to say that we wouldn't have, at some point in time, 2 schools that are offering ESL, or back to the 3 K-4 schools that are offering ESL. Because I know somebody had asked that.
Yeah, and if you do concentrate your program in one school and bus your kids there, parents always have a right to request that their kid go to the home school. And if they do, you've got to provide a program for them there. You know, you've got to do something. So.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Well,
All right, thanks.
Might be lunchtime. Thank you very much, Bob, for being here.